Figure 11.13, Event Registration for JTextField, TextField 1. So let's discuss how event registration and the event handling mechanism actually work based on that last example that we looked at. One of the key things that most people have a little trouble with when they're first getting into graphical user interface implementations is the fact that methods get called for you. I'll call it auto-magically, meaning that you don't really see where the method calls are happening. You are told that you can define a particular method and that magically that method will get called behind the scenes, and most people don't really have a full understanding of how that works. Well, it turns out there's nothing magical about what's going on in the event handling mechanism. Back in our code in the constructor for the last example, we saw that we had a statement textfield1 dot add action listener, and we gave it a reference to an object that we called handler of type textfield handler. Now, that statement is the so-called event registration statement. And it turns out what it's doing is it's actually embedding a reference inside the GUI component itself to the listener object so that when the event occurs on the GUI component can notify its listener that the event occurred by calling the appropriate event listening method, in this case, action performed. Now, it turns out that every one of our GUI components contains a so-called listener list, which contains all of the registered listeners for various types of events on a given GUI component. And that means they could be action listeners or other types of listeners. For example, we have mouse listeners and key listeners and mouse motion listeners and a variety of other types as well. So all of the listener objects get a reference placed into this underlying data structure that the listener list refers to in each individual GUI component object. So there is actually a hard-coded reference between the GUI component and its listener object or objects. And you can see here the result of the add action listener call is to embed that reference to our handler object, and now the JTextField object knows about the corresponding text field handler object. Now, as I mentioned, there's many different types of events that you can use for each GUI component in Java. So it turns out that the way that a given object is able to notify its listeners depends on the type of the event that occurred and whether or not a listener was registered for that type of event. So each of the references in this underlying data structure refer to something that is an event listener, but it could be an action listener, it could be a mouse listener, it could be a mouse motion listener, it could be a key listener of some sort. There's a lot of different possibilities. So what happens is once we've embedded this reference by registering the event handler, then the system is waiting for events to occur, and as they occur, they are first delivered to the particular GUI component that the user interacted with. The GUI component determines what type of event that was, and in turn notifies only the registered listeners that were set up to respond to that type of event. So for example, if I press enter in the text field, text field 1, the text field, when it receives the event, is going to walk through this underlying data structure of listeners, and one at a time it's going to check to see if the current listener is an action listener, which is the type of event handler for pressing enter in a text field. If the answer to that question is yes, it will then use this reference to invoke the action listener's action performed method. So if it's a mouse listener, it's going to invoke other methods by other names. But if it's an action listener, it has to have this method, which is one of the reasons why our event listener objects must implement appropriate interfaces based on the type of event that we wish to handle. So every single type of event has a corresponding listener interface. Some of those interfaces define only one method, some of them define many methods. For example, a mouse listener has 5 methods and a mouse motion listener has 2 methods. We'll talk about those in subsequent examples. And then based on which listener interface you implement, you would then define the appropriate methods that will get called by the GUI component when those types of events occur. Now, a big outstanding question is, number one, how do I know what events a particular GUI component supports? And then number two, when I see many of them, how do I know which one to choose? Well, if you're using a GUI design tool, sometimes the GUI design tool already knows for you which ones are the most common events for a given object, and will choose that simply by having you double click on a GUI component to say, I want to handle this GUI component's event. In other cases, the GUI design tools don't help you as much through that, and you'll need to understand more about the GUI component types before you can figure out what events they support. So let's talk about JTextField a little bit more by going to the online documentation for the JTextField class. JTextField is in the javax.swing package, so I'm going to scroll down to the javax.swing package here, and I'm going to locate the JTextField class. And within that class, I can first of all see the hierarchy of all the types that make up the functionality of class JTextField. And right away, one of the things that you should do anytime you use a class for the first time is study this hierarchical information. Because any place where I can use a JText component, a J component, a container, or a component, I can use a JTextField in my code. So for example, I talked about the add method for attaching GUI components to a JFrame. The add method takes as its argument a component, and anything that is a component can be passed into that method to be attached to a window. So in this case, we see all sorts of classes that lead up to the concept of a JTextField. Now, when I go to the method listing for class JTextField, sometimes you'll see methods like this one right here, add action listener. You'll see these methods that start with the word add and end with listener. That is your first hint at the type of event that a particular GUI component supports. Now, if the GUI component has only one such add listener method, then it represents the kind of default or primary type of event for that GUI component. Now, it turns out there are other add listener methods available to us in class JTextField. Those come from other classes before us in the hierarchy. So if I go to JText component, for example, and go to its method summary, I can see that there's another one called add caret listener, one called add input method listener as well. And if I go back to the top of the page once again and I click J component and I go to its method listing, I see add ancestor listener, add vetoable change listener. And if I go back again to the class container and look at its methods, I now can see add container listener, add property change listener a couple of times here. And if I go all the way back to class component, once again, I will see other add listener methods, add component listener, add focus listener, add hierarchy bounds listener, add hierarchy listener, add input method listener, add key listener, mouse motion listener. As you can see, there are many different add listener methods that we inherit all the way back into our JTextField class that we can then use in our examples to process events of a JTextField. So again, if you look at the primary GUI component that you're concerned with, and in its method listing there's only one add listener method, you know right away what type of listener you need to use for the so-called primary event type for that GUI component. The other thing is that the description of the GUI component will often talk about the different types of events that can occur on an object of that type. And in other cases, they'll even provide you with links to actual examples of the GUI component in action that are part of the online Java tutorial on the Sun Microsystems website. Now, let's take one more moment to talk about another GUI component that might have more than one add listener method in its most recently defined set of methods. So for example, we're going to be looking at another GUI component called the JCombo box. So I'm going to pull that up on the screen here. And when I go to the method listing for JCombo box, you can see that there is an an add action listener method, an add item listener method, and an add pop-up menu listener method. And in this case, we have three different top level, if you will, event types that are associated with a JCombo box, which is a drop-down list. If you simply wanted to know that a selection was made, you could use the Add Action Listener to register an action listener. If you want to know specifically what item was selected, you might add an item listener, which gives you more information about the event that occurred. And your choice of which of these to use may be based on the type of information that the action listener or item listener will receive in its corresponding method. In the case of an action listener, if I click this link, I can go to its method, see that it receives an action event, and then click that link and see what it means to be an action event, what types of data are available to me, what types of constructors, what types of methods, and then also based on the hierarchy of event types, whatever other information might come from these other classes could be useful to me. If I find that the information provided via an action event is not really what I'm looking for, instead I can go to the Add Item Listener, click the Item Listener link. That brings me to the interface item listener. For that interface, we see that it requires an item state changed method, and that receives automatically an item event object. So if I go check that out, I might find that within its methods, I've got additional information that could be useful for me, such as the get state change method or the get item method, which tells you the specific item that the user selected. So again, it takes a little bit of research if the tool is not good at helping you with the selection of which type of event to listen for. But if you look for those add listener methods on a GUI component by GUI component basis, that will help give you a hint as to which types of events are most important for that GUI type. And then separately, remember you inherit many different event types as well from the superclasses in the hierarchy. So in addition to the primary events, you might sometimes be interested in other types of events like mouse or key events as well, and you can also register to handle those. Most GUI design tools give you the ability to select any type of event that you might want to register, and when they generate the code, what they will typically do is create something called an anonymous inner class, which we'll show you in a coming example, to handle the event, and then they will create a separate method for you to define the body of the event handler saying what it is you wish to do when the event occurs.
Looking to advance your career by acquiring new skills? Tired of expensive off-site training programs? Wish you could learn from the best instructors in the industry? Look no further than Live Lessons. Self-paced, personal video instruction by the world's leading technology publishers. Each live lesson comes with a DVD featuring 3 to 4 hours of instructor-led classroom training, sample program code that allows you to work along with your personal instructor, and an example-rich study guide. Live lessons allow you to watch the entire course from start to finish, or navigate directly to any of the individual lessons. You'll literally watch over the shoulder of your instructor as he shows you how to build state-of-the-art applications. Live Lessons, the power of the world's leading technology experts at your fingertips. To learn more, visit mylivelessons.com today.